March 1958, New York City. The Empire Room at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel had just witnessed one of the most painful performances in its distinguished history, a debut that had begun with promise and ended in catastrophe when the 22-year-old singer forgot her lyrics, missed her cues, and finally fled the stage in tears, while the orchestra played on without her. The audience of Manhattan socialites and entertainment executives sat in uncomfortable silence as waiters resumed serving dessert and coffee, pretending that nothing unusual had occurred during what was supposed to be the introduction of a major new talent to the New York nightclub scene. Behind the velvet curtains that separated the glamorous dining room from the cramped backstage area, Angela Marie DeLuca sat crumpled on a wooden crate, her mascara running in dark rivers down cheeks that had been carefully made up just 2 hours earlier when everything still seemed possible. Her emerald gown, borrowed from a designer who had hoped to gain publicity from her success, was stained with the champagne she had spilled during her panicked exit from a stage that had suddenly become hostile territory. The sobs that escaped her were loud enough to be heard in the corridor outside, but the stagehands and musicians who passed by averted their eyes and quickened their steps, unwilling to engage with a failure that might be contagious in an industry where association with disaster could damage careers built over decades of careful reputation management. Angela was alone in the way that only someone who has publicly failed can understand, abandoned by the very people who had crowded around her with congratulations and predictions of stardom just hours before. She had been discovered 6 months earlier by a talent scout who had heard her singing in a small club in Philadelphia, her hometown where she had been performing since the age of 16 for audiences who loved her without reservation. The scout had promised her everything: recording contracts, television appearances, headlining slots at the most prestigious venues in America. All she had to do was trust him and follow his instructions, which she had done with the naive faith of someone who had never been betrayed by people claiming to have her best interests at heart. The Waldorf Astoria engagement was supposed to be her coronation. The moment when Angela Marie DeLuca was introduced to the sophisticated audiences who would carry her to the stardom that the scout had promised was her destiny. Instead, it had become her execution, a public demonstration of everything that could go wrong when a talented but inexperienced performer was thrust onto a stage she was not ready to command. The nerves had started during sound check that afternoon, a creeping anxiety that manifested as shortness of breath and trembling hands that she had tried to control through techniques she had read about in books written by performers far more experienced than she would ever be. By the time she stood in the wings waiting for her introduction, the anxiety had become a full-blown panic attack that she concealed behind a smile that felt like a mask painted onto someone else's face. The first song had gone reasonably well, or at least she had made it through to the end without obvious disaster. But during the second number, a ballad that required her to sustain notes that suddenly seemed impossible to reach, her voice had cracked on the crucial high phrase that was supposed to demonstrate her range to an audience that was already growing skeptical of the hype that had preceded her appearance. From that moment, everything unraveled with the terrifying momentum of a nightmare, from which she could not awaken no matter how desperately she tried. She forgot lyrics she had known perfectly since childhood, entered verses at the wrong time, and finally stood frozen at the microphone while the orchestra played an introduction that she could not remember how to follow into the song that was supposed to conclude her set. The walk off the stage was the longest of her life, each step carrying her further from the dreams that had sustained her through years of performing in clubs where the biggest hope was earning enough to pay the rent on the tiny apartment she shared with 2 other aspiring singers in Philadelphia. She had wanted this so badly, had sacrificed so much to get here, and now it was over before it had truly begun. The talent scout who had brought her to New York was nowhere to be found, having disappeared into the crowd the moment her performance began to falter. He had invested money in her preparation, money that he now considered lost, along with any hope of recouping his investment through the commissions he had expected to earn from her future success. In the brutal arithmetic of the entertainment industry, Angela had become worthless the moment she proved unable to deliver what had been promised. The crate on which she sat had once held costumes for performers whose names were written in lights above theater marquees across Manhattan. Now it served as a throne of failure for a young woman who had believed that talent was enough to guarantee success in a world that demanded so much more than mere ability to sing beautifully when conditions were perfect. She did not hear the footsteps approaching from the corridor. So lost was she in the depths of despair that had swallowed her completely in the minutes since she had fled the stage. The first indication that she was no longer alone came when a white handkerchief appeared in her field of vision, offered by a hand that was attached to an arm in a perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket. Angela looked up through tear-blurred eyes and found herself staring at a face that every American would have recognized instantly. Blue eyes that seemed to hold both understanding and assessment, a thin face that had graced magazine covers and movie screens and album jackets for nearly 2 decades, and an expression that combined sympathy with something that looked almost like recognition. Frank Sinatra stood before her, having wandered backstage after watching her performance from a table near the back of the Empire Room where he had been dining with friends. He had seen the disaster unfold from the beginning, had watched the young woman's confidence shatter in real time, and had felt something stir in him that he had not experienced in years. The memory of his own failures during the dark period of the early 1950s, when his career had seemed finished. He said nothing at first, simply extending the handkerchief and waiting for her to take it with hands that trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. When she finally looked at him with eyes that showed both shame and confusion about why the most famous entertainer in America was standing in front of her in a backstage corridor, he smiled with a warmth that his reputation for coldness might have suggested he was incapable of producing. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in that backstage corridor of the Waldorf Astoria in March 1958 involves one of the worst moments in a young singer's life, the unexpected appearance of Frank Sinatra, and the one thing he said that would transform her understanding of failure and eventually lead to one of the most remarkable comeback stories in entertainment history. By the end of this story, you will understand why that night became the foundation for everything Angela Marie De Luca would achieve. Francis Albert Sinatra had experienced his own catastrophic failures, moments when the career that had seemed destined for eternal success had crumbled around him with a speed that still shocked him years later when he allowed himself to remember those dark days. The early 1950s had been brutal, a period when his voice failed, his marriages collapsed, and the Bobby Soxers who had screamed at his concerts in the 1940s had moved on to newer, younger idols who seemed to offer what he no longer could provide. He had lost his recording contract with Columbia, had been dropped by his talent agency, and had watched his film career dissolve as studios concluded that whatever magic had once made him a box office draw had evaporated along with the voice that had been his primary gift to the world. He had been written off by an industry that showed no mercy to those who fell from grace, regardless of how high they had once risen. The comeback had begun with From Here to Eternity, a film role that he had begged for and won against the wishes of studio executives who considered him washed up and unreliable. His Oscar-winning performance as Maggio had reminded Hollywood that he was more than just a singer, that he possessed acting abilities that had been overlooked during the years when his voice had been enough to guarantee success. The recording contract with Capitol Records had followed, a second chance that he had seized with a desperation born of knowing exactly how close he had come to permanent obscurity. The albums he recorded during the following years represented some of the finest work of his career, mature and emotionally complex in ways that his earlier pop hits had never been. He had rebuilt himself completely, emerging from the ashes as something greater than he had been before. That experience of failure and resurrection had given Sinatra a perspective that few in the entertainment industry possessed, an understanding that success was not a destination, but a journey that included valleys as deep as the peaks were high. He recognized in Angela's tears something he had felt himself, the crushing weight of public failure that seemed at the time to be final and irreversible. The words he spoke to her in that corridor were not recorded, but witnesses who passed by during the conversation would later describe an exchange that lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which Sinatra did most of the talking, while Angela listened with an intensity that suggested she was absorbing every word, as if her life depended on remembering what was being said. He talked about his own failures, about the nights when he had wanted to give up completely and pursue some other career that did not require him to expose himself to public judgment night after night. He talked about the moment when he realized that failure was not the end, but merely a stage in a journey that could lead to places he had never imagined possible during the years of easy success. Most importantly, he talked about the difference between a single performance and a career, between one bad night and the accumulated body of work that would ultimately define how an artist was remembered. He told her that what had happened tonight was painful but not fatal, that audiences forgot failures as quickly as they forgot successes, and that the only thing that mattered was whether she had the courage to get back on stage and prove that she deserved to be there. Angela listened with the concentration of someone receiving a lifeline thrown across an abyss that had seemed certain to swallow her completely. The words coming from Frank Sinatra's mouth were not empty encouragement, but hard-won wisdom from someone who had survived exactly what she was experiencing and had emerged stronger on the other side. When Sinatra finished speaking, he handed her a card with a phone number written on the back and told her to call him in 1 week, after she had time to process what had happened and decide whether she wanted to continue pursuing a career in an industry that would never stop testing her resolve. He made no promises about what would happen if she called, only that he would be willing to talk with her again if she still wanted to pursue this path. Then he was gone, disappearing into the maze of backstage corridors with the same quiet efficiency with which he had appeared. Angela sat alone on the crate for another hour, turning the card over in her hands and wondering whether the encounter had actually happened or whether her traumatized mind had conjured a hallucination to soften the blow of the evening's disaster. The week that followed was the longest of Angela's life, a period of agonizing self-examination during which she questioned everything about her decision to pursue a career in music. The scout who had brought her to New York had stopped returning her calls, confirming that he had written her off as a lost cause. The designer who had loaned her the gown sent a bill for cleaning and repairs. The newspapers that had previewed her debut with such enthusiasm published brief notices of her failure that made her cringe every time she saw them. She returned to Philadelphia by train, unable to afford airfare after the expenses of her New York adventure had exhausted her meager savings. Her roommates tried to console her with platitudes about other opportunities and better nights to come, but their words rang hollow in the face of what she had experienced on a stage that had seemed like the gateway to everything she had ever wanted. The card sat on her dresser, a constant reminder of the encounter that still seemed impossible despite the physical evidence that it had actually occurred. She picked it up dozens of times, studying Sinatra's handwriting as if it might reveal some hidden message about what she should do next. But the decision could not be made by staring at a card. It had to be made in her heart. On the 7th day, exactly 1 week after the disaster at the Waldorf Astoria, Angela picked up the telephone and dialed the number written on the back of the card. Her hands trembled as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and she was about to hang up when a voice answered that she recognized immediately from countless records and films. Sinatra remembered her, asked how she was doing, and listened as she explained that she had decided to continue pursuing her career despite the humiliation of her New York debut. He seemed pleased by her decision, telling her that the hardest part was choosing to go on rather than surrendering to the comfort of giving up. Then he made an offer that would change everything. He invited her to attend one of his recording sessions in Los Angeles as an observer, to see how professional recording was done and to meet people in the industry who might be helpful to her career. He offered to pay for her travel and lodging, asking nothing in return except that she promised to take the opportunity seriously and learn everything she could from the experience. Angela accepted immediately, unable to believe that the worst night of her life had somehow led to an invitation from the most successful entertainer in America. She packed her bags and flew to Los Angeles for the first time in her life, arriving in a city that seemed to glow with possibility, despite the fears that still lingered from her New York disaster. The recording session was for an album that would become one of Sinatra's most celebrated works, a collection of ballads that showcased his mature vocal style and emotional depth. Angela sat in the control room, watching as the master worked with musicians and engineers to create something that seemed to transcend mere entertainment and approach art. Sinatra introduced her to the people present as a talented young singer who was going to be very successful if she could survive the learning curve that every great artist had to navigate. The introductions opened doors that would have remained permanently closed to someone without such powerful sponsorship. Connections that Angela would nurture carefully in the months and years to come. She stayed in Los Angeles for 2 weeks, attending multiple sessions and meeting industry professionals who treated her with respect because of Sinatra's endorsement. The experience was transformative, providing a masterclass in professionalism that her brief and disastrous New York debut had failed to teach her. When she returned to Philadelphia, Angela was a different person than the broken young woman who had fled the Waldorf Astoria stage in tears. She had seen how the best in the business operated, had learned lessons that would guide her for the rest of her career, and had made connections that would prove invaluable when she was ready to try again. The comeback began slowly, with small club dates in Philadelphia and the surrounding region that allowed her to rebuild her confidence away from the spotlight that had destroyed her in New York. She worked on her stage presence, developed techniques for managing anxiety, and gradually transformed herself from a talented but fragile performer into a professional who could handle whatever unexpected challenges arose during live performance. Sinatra checked on her progress periodically, phone calls that came at random intervals and lasted anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour, depending on how much time he had and how much Angela had to report. He offered advice when asked, criticism when necessary, and encouragement always, the kind of mentorship that he had never received during his own rise to fame. 2 years after her Waldorf Astoria disaster, Angela returned to New York for another engagement, this time at a smaller venue that carried less pressure and lower expectations. She performed flawlessly, channeling the lessons she had learned from Sinatra and the experience she had accumulated during 2 years of rebuilding. The reviews were positive, noting that a promising career that had seemed finished was apparently still in progress. The recording contract came in 1962, 4 years after her first disaster, with a label that appreciated her style and was willing to invest in developing her career rather than expecting immediate commercial success. Her debut album sold modestly, but earned critical praise that established her as an artist of substance rather than merely another pretty voice. The career that followed was not legendary in the way that Sinatra's was, but it was successful and fulfilling in ways that the 22-year-old crying backstage at the Waldorf Astoria could never have imagined possible. Angela recorded 12 albums over 25 years, toured internationally, and built a following among audiences who appreciated the emotional authenticity that had survived the crucible of her early failure. She and Sinatra maintained their friendship throughout the decades that followed, a bond that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances when a man at the height of his fame took the time to comfort a stranger at the lowest point of hers. He attended her wedding in 1965, sent flowers when her children were born, and remained a presence in her life until his death in 1998. Angela was among those who attended Sinatra's funeral, sitting with the friends and family who gathered to say goodbye to a man whose influence on American music and culture was immeasurable. She wept during the service, mourning not only the loss of a legend, but the loss of a friend who had saved her career and possibly her life during a moment of despair that might otherwise have ended differently. The Waldorf Astoria Empire Room, where it all began, closed in 2017, ending an era of elegant supper club entertainment that had defined New York nightlife for generations. Angela visited the empty space one last time before the closure, standing in the room where she had failed so publicly and remembering the backstage corridor where Frank Sinatra had found her crying and changed everything with his kindness and wisdom. She told the story of that night countless times over the years, in interviews and speeches and conversations with young performers who were facing their own moments of doubt and failure. The message was always the same: failure was not fatal, success was not final, and the only thing that mattered was having the courage to continue when giving up seemed like the easier option. Angela Marie DeLuca died on October 12, 2015, at the age of 79, after a life that had included far more triumph than the young woman crying backstage at the Waldorf Astoria, could have imagined possible. Her obituaries mentioned the Sinatra connection prominently, recognizing it as the turning point that had made everything else possible. Her children and grandchildren carry her memory and her music into a future that she helped create by refusing to let one bad night define the rest of her life. They know the story of the night Frank Sinatra found her crying alone backstage and told her that failure was not the end but merely the beginning of something new. The handkerchief that Sinatra gave her that night remained in her possession until her death, a simple white cloth that had been transformed by circumstance into a relic of one of the most important moments in her life. She kept it in a drawer next to the card with his phone number, artifacts from an encounter that had seemed impossible then and seemed miraculous now. The entertainment industry that had seemed so cruel on the night of her first disaster proved to be capable of redemption when given enough time and enough evidence that a failure could become a success if allowed the opportunity to grow and develop. Angela's story became an example cited by those who believed in second chances and the human capacity for transformation. The night at the Waldorf Astoria taught Angela lessons about performance anxiety that she would carry throughout her career and eventually teach to younger performers facing similar challenges. She learned that preparation alone was not enough, that mental strength had to be cultivated with the same dedication as vocal technique. The breathing exercises she developed during the 2 years of rebuilding after her disaster became part of her pre-performance ritual, a way of centering herself before stepping onto stages that would never again feel as terrifying as the Empire Room had felt on that catastrophic March evening in 1958. She also learned the importance of choosing the right material for the right venue, understanding that what worked in small Philadelphia clubs might not translate to sophisticated Manhattan audiences without significant adjustment. Her New York debut had failed partly because she had performed songs that were too raw and emotional for an audience expecting polished entertainment. The talent scout who had abandoned her after the disaster eventually called to apologize. Years later, when Angela's career had proved that his initial assessment of her talent had been correct, even if his timing and preparation had been catastrophically wrong. She accepted his apology without granting him any role in her subsequent success. Frank Sinatra's own experience with comeback informed everything he taught Angela during their conversations and the time she spent observing his recording sessions. He understood viscerally what it felt like to be dismissed as finished, and he had developed strategies for rebuilding that he was willing to share with someone who reminded him of his younger self. The Capitol Records sessions, she observed, became a masterclass in how professionals approached the creation of enduring art. She watched Sinatra work with arrangers and musicians, making adjustments and refinements that transformed good songs into great recordings that would be remembered decades after the sessions concluded. The engineers who worked on those sessions treated their craft with a respect that Angela had never witnessed during her limited experience in professional recording environments. Every microphone placement, every level adjustment, every decision about reverb and echo was made with careful consideration of how it would affect the final product. The musicians who accompanied Sinatra were among the finest in the world, studio players whose skills had been honed through years of recording with the biggest names in American music. They approached each session with a professionalism that set the standard for everyone else in the room. Angela absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone who understood that she had been given an opportunity that most aspiring performers could only dream about. She took notes, asked questions when appropriate, and filed away observations that would inform her own approach to recording when she finally earned the chance to enter a studio herself. The 2 weeks in Los Angeles transformed her understanding of what it meant to be a professional entertainer, raising the bar for her own aspirations while simultaneously showing her that the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be was not insurmountable if she was willing to do the work. She returned to Philadelphia with a new sense of purpose that replaced the despair that had nearly destroyed her after the Waldorf Astoria disaster. The failure was still painful to remember, but it no longer felt like the end of everything. It felt like the beginning of something that might eventually become even more meaningful than immediate success would have been. The small club dates that followed her Los Angeles trip were approached with a discipline that she had not possessed before watching Sinatra work. She prepared for each performance, as if it were the most important of her life, because she now understood that every performance was an opportunity to either advance or damage a career that could only be built one night at a time. The audiences in Philadelphia and the surrounding cities noticed the change in Angela's stage presence, the new confidence that came from understanding exactly how much work went into appearing effortless. She was no longer just a talented young woman with a beautiful voice. She was becoming a professional who could command a room regardless of circumstances. The reviews of her club performances improved steadily over the months and years following her Los Angeles trip, tracking her development from promising newcomer to accomplished performer. Critics who had written her off after the Waldorf Astoria disaster began to reconsider their assessments as evidence accumulated that she had learned from her failure. The recording contract that finally came in 1962 was with a smaller label than she might have hoped for during those heady days when the talent scout was promising her the world, but it was real, and it was earned rather than given. The executives who signed her had seen her perform and believed in her talent on its own merits. The debut album sessions were challenging in ways that her brief observations of Sinatra's work had prepared her to expect. Creating a coherent artistic statement from individual song performances required patience and revision that tested her newfound professionalism to its limits. But she emerged from those sessions with a product she was genuinely proud of. 12 songs that showcased her voice and her emotional range without the desperate need to impress that had undermined her Waldorf Astoria performance 4 years earlier. She had learned that trying too hard was as dangerous as not trying hard enough. The album received respectful reviews and modest sales that established her as a viable recording artist, without creating expectations that might have crushed her if she had been unable to meet them. She was building a career brick by brick, exactly as Sinatra had suggested during their conversations about the difference between overnight success and lasting achievement. The friendship with Sinatra deepened over the following years as Angela's career developed, and she proved worthy of the investment he had made in her potential. He invited her to open for him at several concerts, exposures that introduced her to audiences who might otherwise never have discovered her work. These opening slots were tests that she passed by applying everything she had learned since the disaster that had brought them together. She no longer froze when audiences seemed indifferent. She no longer panicked when technical problems disrupted her performances. She had become the professional that Sinatra had seen hiding inside the crying girl backstage at the Waldorf Astoria. The handkerchief he had given her that night became a talisman that she carried to every performance for the rest of her career, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had come since a stranger's kindness had shown her that failure was not the end, but merely a painful beginning. It was tucked into her purse during every show, a secret connection to the man who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. The years between Angela's comeback and her eventual retirement were filled with moments that validated everything Sinatra had told her in that backstage corridor about the difference between a single failure and a lifetime of work. She performed in venues across America and Europe, building a reputation that grew stronger with each passing year as audiences discovered her music. Her second album, released in 1964, achieved greater commercial success than her debut and established her as a consistent presence on the adult contemporary charts that tracked sophisticated vocal music. The reviews noted her growth as an interpreter, her ability to find emotional depths in songs that lesser singers treated as mere entertainment. The marriage to Michael Fontaine in 1965 brought stability to a personal life that had been chaotic during the years of struggle and rebuilding. Michael was a music producer who understood the demands of her career and supported her ambitions without trying to control or redirect them toward goals that served his interests rather than hers. Sinatra attended the wedding in a small Catholic church in Philadelphia, his presence causing a stir among guests who had not expected the most famous entertainer in America to appear at what was supposed to be an intimate family celebration. He gave a toast that moved Angela to tears, speaking about the journey she had taken from the floor of a backstage corridor to the altar of a church, surrounded by people who loved her. The birth of her first child in 1967 tested Angela's commitment to her career, in ways that Sinatra had warned her about during their conversations about the sacrifices required to maintain success in an industry that consumed everything and everyone who entered its orbit. She took 6 months away from performing, the longest break of her career, before returning to stages that had not forgotten her. The second child arrived in 1970, and Angela had learned to balance the demands of motherhood with the requirements of a career that she was unwilling to abandon, despite the guilt that sometimes accompanied leaving her children with nannies while she traveled to perform for audiences in distant cities. Michael proved to be the partner she needed, managing household responsibilities during her absences and never making her feel that she was failing as a mother by pursuing the career that had been saved from destruction by Frank Sinatra's intervention 12 years earlier. Their partnership endured challenges that destroyed other marriages in the entertainment industry. The 1970s brought changes to the music industry that affected Angela's career in ways she had not anticipated when she first signed her recording contract. The rise of rock music and changing tastes among younger audiences meant that the sophisticated vocal style she had developed found smaller audiences than it had during the early 1960s. She adapted by focusing on live performance and cabaret venues, where her style was still appreciated by audiences who valued craftsmanship over novelty. The club circuit that had once been a stepping stone to bigger things became her primary artistic home, a world where she could connect directly with audiences who came specifically to hear her sing. Sinatra's own career underwent similar transitions during these years, his audience aging along with him, while younger generations discovered his music through their parents' record collections. The two discussed these changes during their occasional phone calls, comparing notes on strategies for remaining relevant in an industry that constantly demanded reinvention. The tribute concert that Angela organized for Sinatra's 70th birthday in 1985 brought together artists from multiple generations who had been influenced by his work, or, like Angela, had been personally helped by his generosity during vulnerable moments in their careers. The evening raised money for charities that Sinatra supported and provided a public acknowledgement of the impact he had made beyond his recorded legacy. Angela performed 3 songs during the tribute concert, selections that showcased her development, from the nervous young woman who had frozen on the Waldorf Astoria stage to the confident professional who could command any room regardless of the audience's initial expectations. Sinatra watched from a front-row seat, visibly moved by her performance. After the concert, they shared a private moment backstage that echoed their first encounter 27 years earlier, though the circumstances could not have been more different. Angela thanked him again for everything he had done, and Sinatra deflected the gratitude with characteristic gruffness, while his eyes betrayed the emotion he preferred not to express directly. The final decade of Sinatra's life was marked by declining health that gradually reduced his public appearances and eventually silenced the voice that had defined American popular music for half a century. Angela visited him several times during these years. Conversations that were sometimes lucid and sometimes confused as age and illness took their toll. Barbara Sinatra welcomed Angela during these visits, understanding that her husband's relationship with the singer he had rescued from despair represented one of the purest expressions of his capacity for kindness that existed independent of any romantic or commercial motivation. Angela was simply someone he had helped because he could, and because he remembered what it felt like to need help. The news of Sinatra's death on May 14, 1998, reached Angela while she was preparing for a performance in Chicago that she considered cancelling before deciding that Frank would have wanted her to continue working rather than abandoning her audience to mourn privately. She dedicated that evening's performance to his memory. The funeral in Los Angeles brought together celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Frank Sinatra's music and, in some cases, by his personal intervention during moments of crisis. Angela sat with other artists who had similar stories, a community of people who understood that the man being mourned was far more complex than any single narrative could capture. She spoke at a memorial service held weeks later, sharing the story of their first meeting with an audience that included family members and close friends who had heard various versions over the years, but who listened with fresh appreciation as Angela described the moment when a white handkerchief appeared in her field of vision and changed everything. The handkerchief itself, worn thin from decades of handling, was displayed at the memorial alongside other artifacts from Sinatra's life that his family had chosen to share with those who gathered to remember him. Angela had loaned it for the occasion, retrieving it afterward to return to the drawer where it had lived since becoming too fragile for her to carry to performances. In the years following Sinatra's death, Angela became a keeper of his legacy in ways that extended beyond her own story, to encompass the broader narrative of an era when entertainers were larger than life, and personal connections between artists could shape careers in ways that the modern music industry no longer allowed. She spoke at events honoring his memory and contributed to documentaries that explored his complex character. Rest in peace, Angela Marie De Luca. Your voice deserved to be heard, and thanks to one man's decision to walk backstage and offer a handkerchief to a crying stranger, it was heard by audiences who never knew how close they came to never experiencing your gift. And rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that defined an era also spoke that night to a broken young woman who needed to hear that failure was not fatal and that the only true defeat was giving up. What you said in that corridor changed a life and proved that kindness costs nothing but can mean everything to someone who has lost all hope.